You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. We'll have more news this evening, but first...
The latest Gene-ology, a Roddenberry podcast.
Episode 31, The Yuma Treasure. Welcome to Mission Log Gene-ology. I'm Earl Green.
And I'm Norman Lau.
Each week on Gene-ology, we go digging into Gene Roddenberry's pre-Star Trek TV scripts, mining a rich vein of the kind of morals, meanings, and messages that would become a mainstay of his later work.
This week, we're hunting for the Yuma Treasure, Gene's second episode for the hit 1950s Western Have Gun, Will Travel. Earl will be back with trivia in a moment, but first, here's how you can reach us. Gene-ology is meant to be entertaining and informative, but it's also the beginning of an ongoing conversation about the works of Gene Roddenberry. Drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com and join us on X and Facebook at missionlogpod. While you're at it, leave us a review and a rating at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. And please remember your comments could be used on future installments of Gene-ology. And now here's Earl Green with this week's trivia. This week's trivia.
Well, thank you, Norman. I hope this trivia is a treasure, because welcome, my friends, to the month of Roddenberry. Okay, I mean, every month is the month of Roddenberry here on Gene-ology, but as far as Have Gun, Will Travel viewers were concerned, over the holiday season of 1957 into 58, this was Roddenberry time, peak Roddenberry. Airing on December 14th, 1957, The Yuma Treasure was the first of 4 consecutive episodes of Have Gun written by Gene. This gives us an excellent opportunity to examine the question of whether or not Gene was Have Gun's quote-unquote head writer, which is a claim that Gene often later made himself. That's a slightly complicated question because as far as the network and the producers were concerned, there really was no head writer on the show. And Have Gun had a grueling schedule of 38 or 39 episodes a year for 6 years, frequently shooting on location, with its star weighing heavily on decisions involving casting and staffing, including writing. So it may come as little surprise that the producers effectively running the show when it started were not the same producers who were there at the end. But remember that quote from Richard Boone himself from last week's trivia? He considered Gene to be one of the show's biggest assets. What cannot be disputed is that Gene was one of Have Gun's 2 most prolific writers. He wrote 24 episodes of the series total. 224 episodes of Have Gun, Will Travel were made over 6 seasons. So do the math. Gene wrote 1/10 of this entire show. Harry Julian Fink also wrote 24 episodes, and both writers were very much loved by the production staff, and perhaps even more importantly, by Richard Boone himself, starring as Paladin. One recurring theme that has come up in my research is that if you impressed Richard Boone in whatever capacity you were working on Have Gun, he would do his best to make sure you got to come back for more. And this definitely applied to this episode's top-lining guest star. We have Warren Stevens as Major Wilson. Warren had already appeared alongside Richard in an episode of Boone's previous gig as the star of a series, the medical drama Medic, and Boone used his clout as the star of Have Gun to specifically ask for Warren to be cast in this role. Warren went on to appear in 2 episodes of the Ziv series Science Fiction Theater, co-starred as Doc Ostro in the 1956 Forbidden Planet film, and he would return twice more, obviously in unrelated roles, in later seasons of Have Gun, and would then follow the show's star to his short-lived Playhouse series, The Richard Boone Show, appearing in all 25 episodes of that series. Warren's career would intersect with Gene's again in 1968, when he guest starred in the Star Trek episode By Any Other Name. Warren is also one of a very small number of actors who appeared in both the original Twilight Zone and its 1980s revival. We lost Warren in 2012. And if you, like me, enjoy playing Spot the Future Star Trek guest star, I should point out that Harry Landers, who guest starred here as Lieutenant Harvey, would go on to guest star in the final episode of Star Trek as Dr. Coleman in Turnabout Intruder. Paladin arrives at an isolated U.S. cavalry fort escorted by 2 members of the Maricopa tribe. 2 cavalry officers who greet him treat him very differently. Lieutenant Harvey wants the 2 Native Americans captured, or worse, doesn't really care, and he doesn't take kindly to Paladin interfering when he draws his pistol on them. But Paladin buys time for his escort to escape, and he's able to quote enough U.S. military law to make it clear that he is here by invitation and expects to see the commanding officer, Major Wilson. The sergeant with Harvey snaps to, says yes sir, and walks Paladin and his horse into the fort. In Major Wilson's office, the lieutenant is complaining about Paladin, and it seems everything is fair game, even the company Paladin kept on his way to the fort, which Harvey gripes about in terms that even the Major finds to be racist. But Harvey also includes a veiled jab at Wilson himself, suggesting that he has lost interest in leading his own men. It's clear that there is no love lost between the commanding officer and his second-in-command. When Paladin arrives in Major Wilson's office, Wilson apologizes for Lieutenant Harvey's behavior, with Harvey in the room, and tries to find some common ground with Paladin. Hey, aren't we both graduates of West Point? Funny, I don't remember anyone named Paladin there. But Paladin is not there to talk school days. He's here to talk business, and the fact that a fellow officer referred Wilson to him to help solve a problem. The problem is a deadly one. Wilson has lost 2 men who wandered onto Maricopa tribal land, and then Wilson retaliated. The result? His isolated outpost and the tribe are on the verge of all-out war. Wilson, whose years of service have only paid him enough to save up the tiniest of nest eggs, worries that he can't afford Paladin's services. Paladin makes clear that he expects a complete rundown of the situation, the whole truth, and he will decide how much his help will cost, and no amount of appealing to Paladin as a fellow West Point man will change this. But Paladin does know one thing. Where Wilson sees only 2 options, war or ending his military career in disgrace, Paladin sees a third option, asking the Maricopas what their side of the story is, and he wants the Major to ride out with him first thing in the morning to ask that question. Act 2. As Paladin and the Major ride cautiously into Maricopa country, they are watched at every turn by the tribe's warriors. They come to a stop when they spot a rattlesnake hanging from a tree limb. Wilson draws his gun to deal with it, but Paladin stops him. He knows exactly what this means. He dismounts his horse and removes the snake from the tree with his bare hands, and then proceeds on foot, carefully carrying the snake over his head. They walk until they find themselves face to face with the tribe's leaders, who acknowledge and speak with Paladin. By carrying the snake like that, Paladin made it obvious that he came in peace, because he did not have a free hand to reach for a weapon. So that's it for the feats of strength. Now it's time for the airing of grievances. Why have Major Wilson's men been killed? Chief Gerada of the Maricopas disputes Wilson's story that the soldiers were hunting meat. They were searching for the White Blanket, a quartz deposit on Maricopa land, and this problem didn't exist until Wilson delegated leading the patrols to Lieutenant Harvey. When Wilson led his own patrols, his men stayed in line. Wilson has doubts about the story of a quartz deposit, and he'd like the chief to show him and Paladin where it is before he tells his superiors that Lieutenant Harvey has been abusing his position to enrich himself. Gerada will have 2 of his braves take Wilson there in the morning, but only if he is blindfolded. Gerada and Paladin wait at the camp until the next morning. That's when one horse returns, with a wounded member of the tribe slumped over in his saddle. His fears confirmed, Chief Gerada shoots a glance to another of the warriors, who knocks Paladin out and disarms him. Whatever trust Paladin earned to get this far with the Maricopas, Major Wilson has just wasted. Act 3. Paladin awakens in the desert. He's been tied down to stakes hammered into the ground and stripped to the waist. Obviously, the idea was that if the local fauna didn't do him in, the sun and dehydration would finish the job. But Paladin's horse has found him, and between the horse understanding Paladin's verbal commands and some inventive use of the dangling lead line, Paladin is free once again. Once again clothed, Paladin keeps traveling through Maricopa country until he finds Major Wilson's horse with 2 bags of gold strapped to the saddle. He keeps searching on foot until a shot is fired, forcing him to try to find cover in the open. Even though his pistol was confiscated by the Maricopas, Paladin still has his derringer and has to put it to use to disarm Wilson, who fired that shot, but claims it was a mistake. The Major further claims that he survived an attack by the two Braves who were escorting him to see the quartz deposit, but then contradicts himself the longer he keeps talking. Paladin is not buying what Major Wilson is selling. And what the Major is trying to say is, there's not just quartz, but gold laying out in the open. A year's salary in every handful. He and Paladin could be rich. Paladin asks point blank, was this Wilson's plan all along? Wilson, who had only a couple of days earlier tried to appeal to Paladin as a fellow West Pointer, cuts to the chase. Forget West Point. We could be rich men. To Wilson's horror, Paladin strips the 2 bags of gold off of his horse and makes very clear that this gold is no good to a dead man. It's only good for buying their own freedom from the Maricopas. Wilson pleads with Paladin, hey, I risked my life for that gold. Paladin corrects him, you risked my life for it. As Paladin prepares to dump the gold over a sheer drop, Wilson tries to attack and misses, ending up going over the edge, but not before grabbing one of his bags of gold. Paladin is just barely able to get a hold of Wilson's ankle, but the weight of the gold is pulling Wilson further over the edge, and Paladin has to make a decision. Hang on and risk going over the edge with the Major, or simply let go. In the end, Sir Isaac Newton wins. Major Wilson slips out of his own boot and plunges to his death, leaving Paladin with the remaining bag of gold and an empty boot. Paladin throws the remaining gold over the edge after Wilson and discovers that Chief Gerada has been watching the whole thing, and the next words out of Paladin's mouth will decide if he lives or dies. Sure, Paladin values gold, but this gold was not his to take. Gerada and his tribe are finally satisfied that Paladin can live another day, and will cause them no further trouble. When Paladin returns to the fort, it's under new management. Colonel Harrison is now in charge, since obviously Major Wilson won't be back, but neither will Lieutenant Harvey, who faces a number of complaints from the men under his command, including that he was stealing operating funds from the fort. So he's being moved to new accommodations for the next 20 years. But the colonel intends to rewrite a little bit of history to give Major Wilson's story a slightly more heroic end as far as the official record is concerned. Paladin's work here is done, and he strikes out for home. The end.
So far be it from me to not appreciate a subtle yet wonderful reference to Festivus for the rest of us. Great recap, Earl. It's a really complex story, so let's just jump right into it, the observations, and let's see what we came up with.
There is a lot going on here, and I have a lot of thoughts about this, but let's start at the very, very beginning. So last week we were talking about the teaser quote. Mm-hmm. I don't really know what else you would call it, the teaser quote that we hear over the beginning of the opening titles. This week, I took note of the fact that they are not using the audio of that line from later in the episode. When it is part of a scene, Richard Boone is doing a completely different voiceover, and it's a completely different line reading that really strips it of any useful context. And the quote this week was something along the lines of, I can ditch the gold or I can kill you. Either one, the Maricopas will understand.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And this is the quote you hear, as the gun is being pointed at the camera. But the voiceover that's delivered over that shot right before the opening credits has none of the rage that Boone brings to that line later in the episode when you do hear it as part of the scene in context. And I thought about that a little bit. It's like, wow, it's two completely different takes on the same line. That's actually kind of brilliant, because you have absolutely no context for that line. You don't know if it is spoken in anger. You don't know if it's spoken with steely resolve. You've just got to stick around and find out what's up with that line. Who is he saying that to and why?
Yeah, I mean, when we did the previous episode, when he was talking about Billy Joe Kane, he says it in the exact same way he says it in the episode, which is kind of like a tip-off, to, okay, this is, where this came from. It'll be interesting to track this, in future episodes of Gene's, just to see if, he acts out the line, or if he is, like you said, a little bit ambiguous, with the line read. You brought up the gun, so I want to bring up a little bit of history about the gun. So some of our listeners might be interested in the sidearm that Paladin brandishes at the beginning of every credit sequence in this series. Now, I'm looking this up, and You all can too. It's not a secret. From the International Arms Database, Paladin carries a Colt SAA, or Single Action Army, cavalry model as his sidearm. This is the revolver seen in the introduction of each of the episodes, but with a 7.5-inch barrel. The standard barrel is usually 7 inches. This is also known as the M1873 Model P, or Peacemaker. I wonder if there's kind of like a little, intentional pun with that specific weapon, because there were other weapons of the time, but Paladin, the soldier for hire, is carrying a custom-made Peacemaker.
It puts me in mind of a meme I've seen around the character of Mace Windu from the Star Wars prequels, where he's saying something like, we're here to guard the peace. We're not soldiers, which is an actual exchange from I think episode 2 or 3, and the next frame of the meme is Palpatine saying, "You cut a dude's head off," and then the next frame is because it's Samuel L. Jackson, I'm going to have to redact this a little bit. The line that the meme says is, "Yeah, the bleeper was pretty peaceful after that." The location photography in this episode is amazing. You have these wide open mountain vistas. I mean, just the opening shots of the fort. Whoa, this is not some cheap backlot. I mean, they're out there somewhere. Although in my reading, what I found out was, no, they weren't really out there somewhere. It's just that the Western was such a cottage industry at the time that you had locations in Southern California within easy driving distance of LA that were set up specifically to service the production of Westerns in film and television. And so, it was not some far-flung, out-of-the-way location. It's just that there was less development of Southern California at the time, and you could get these sweeping outdoor shots without catching someone's ultra-modern, mid-century modern house up on a hillside obviously being out of place. And it's just beautiful. I mean, again, we have Andrew McLaglen directing, and this was one of those opening shots, really, where it was like, okay, yeah, I can see that this is a protege of John Ford.
I think some of those towns, they still exist, kind of like ghost towns, and then I think you can take tours of those, in Northern California and kind of like the Agua Dulce area, like near Vasquez Rocks.
Right, and that's if they were built out. I mean, some of them may well be facades only, without actually being standing structures.
Like Spectre of the Gun type facades, right?
Right, exactly, which that episode actually used effectively. They made a virtue of it.
I'm a big fan of Westerns. I know you are too, Earl, and I love how differently, like some of the, either the soldiers, the cowboys, they wear their revolvers. Lieutenant Harvey is wearing his revolver but face forward. So it's a reverse grip, holstering. And he has his hand on his gun and his thumb on the hammer as Paladin rides up. I thought that was just an interesting detail because, like, Paladin's he's an expert soldier of fortune. He's like, oh, okay, this is how we're going to do it, huh? Because, he's walking up to these two guys. One has a rifle, the sergeant has a rifle, and the lieutenant has already kind of like half-cocked his pistol. He's like, oh, nice welcome.
Well, I'm sure that has to do with who he rode up to the gates of the fort with.
True enough, yeah.
Because Lieutenant Harvey literally tells the sergeant who has the rifle, get him. Meaning the two Indians that led Paladin to the fort.
Right.
Yeah, after presumably he rode through their country.
Right.
That is their thanks for bringing this person they've been expected. Get him. It's like, oh, man, this guy's one of those, isn't it?
There are, on occasion, lines or scenarios in this episode, such as this line, I've lived with the Yumas. They're related to the Maricopa. This is what Paladin says to Major Wilson, and it just feels like it's an example of how Gene borrowed a lot from what he was doing with Sam Houston and kind of transplanting it into these specific scripts for Paladin. I'm sure we're going to talk about that a little bit later on.
There is definitely some Sam Houston DNA being spliced into Paladin here, but Not all of it. Yeah, I have some serious questions about elements of this script versus what we read with the Sam Houston scripts, but perhaps this is the answer to our question. What happened to the Sam Houston series? It's happening right in front of us. It's just he's not called Sam Houston.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's what's kind of like alluding at. All right, so I don't know if you did any more research on this, Earl, but there's a scene where Paladin and Major Wilson on horse ride up to a tree that has a rattlesnake hanging from it. And Paladin understands the message and meaning of that and uses it as his way to, as a handshake, if you will, to establish his respect for the Maricopa tribal leader. Chief was, I'd never get his Gerada. Was that a real rattlesnake? Because that thing looked live.
It was definitely a live snake in some scenes. Now, here's the thing. I'm sure it was probably some harmless variety of snake that was perhaps painted. And maybe they stuck a little thing on his tail to make him look like a rattlesnake. Of course, I'm saying him. I'm gendering the snake. But I'm sure the snake was completely harmless. But it's interesting that, yeah, there are some scenes where Boone is handling a real snake.
Yeah.
And if he wasn't a fan of horses, I wonder how he felt about that.
I've heard on occasion that they've kind of like devenomed snakes, you know, so that they are authentic. They can hurt you. They just can't kill you.
They could still sink the bite.
Oh, yeah.
But it will not carry poison.
Right.
Okay, that's interesting. It is funny how time changes perception. Now, I was thinking about this. I don't really have a deeper point to make about this. It's just that once upon a time, the casting of the tribe was, that's fine, we'll go with it. The actor who was playing Gerada was actually German-born to American parents.
Shocking in the 1950s. You're kidding.
Yeah. Just, oh, wow, anyone not obviously square-jawed, blue-eyed American, oh, he could be an Indian. He could be any ethnicity. Mm-hmm. Today, if you did this, there would be such an outcry about authenticity and appropriation and other multisyllabic words starting with A. And I'm not making sport of that. I'm not making light of that in any way.
Right.
Those discussions do need to be had.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, it occurred to me while watching this, wow, the needle has moved.
Oh, yeah. And I think that's I think that's a great point to make, especially with this or, with any other of Gene's series or any of the series back then. For whatever reason, I can't say it was for one or another, but that's the way it was. And as long as we have moved significantly past that, now I'm going to quote unquote, air quote significantly in that phrase. As long as we move significantly past that, that's the right thing to do. But at the same time, though, I'm not averse to seeing that in the context of the period when it was produced.
Oh, yeah. I'm not saying erase the tapes, burn the films, wipe the show from history. I'm not saying that at all. Mm. It's just this is an object lesson in how much things have changed.
Absolutely. And you know what? At the same time, though, I was thinking about, certain, ethnic casting choices. And it's also very well possible, not because of anyone's, either fault or the way that the industry works. I don't know any of that. But what I'm saying is there may not have been a Native American Indian actor that was good for the role at the time or at all. So what do you do? Not do the story or do the best you can with the story?
Yeah. Although in hindsight, you have to wonder, was it that there was not an appropriate Native American actor in the guild?
Well, that too, yeah.
Or was it that there were plenty of appropriate Native American actors who could not get white agents to take them seriously or did not want to take these kinds of roles?
Well, it's all of that too, Yeah. So it's. I'm not saying like one.
It's a stew, baby.
Yeah, it's a stew. It's what stew. I love the trope of the noble steed returning to rescue his master. This is when Paladin is basically kind of not really drawn and quartered, but kind of in that position, staked to the sand, baking under the hot sun, and then his noble steed comes up and asks for some Skittles, And if you know that
Drawing
reference,
and quartering him is the only thing that hasn't been done to him.
if you know the Skittles reference, good on you. If you don't, keep listening to our shows.
Skittles was the nickname of a horse that I used to handle who was very derpy. I cannot imagine her coming to my rescue. What is Paladin's horse's name?
You know, I heard him mutter a thing, but I couldn't quite get it.
Yeah, I watched this scene like 2 or 3 times thinking, does he say the name? Is it a he? Is it a she? But all he says to is, come on. Mm-hmm. Come on. Okay, those could be the words to a Billy Idol song. That doesn't give me any information. But I wonder how Richard Boone handled that scene, because he is laying down. The horse is standing over him, all potentially 1,200 pounds of horse standing over him. Richard Boone was not a big fan of horses. He hated having to ride horses. He just sucked it up and did it for this show to maintain the illusion whenever it was absolutely necessary. Of course, I'm sure the horse has a handler. You just imagine someone like Boone, who perhaps was not the most patient man in the universe, putting his life in that handler's hands, as far as where that horse is going to stand, close to Boone's hands, close to his body, if he doesn't have that much trust in horses to begin with. Now, I do want to start a big round of applause here for the director of photography. I went through the end credits and looked him up. William Margulies was the director of photography. And he handles not only the camera work, but the lighting before the camera starts rolling. The scenes of Gerada and Paladin waiting for Major Wilson's return as night starts to fall, those shots are stunning. That is feature-quality shooting on a TV budget. And the shots are just beautiful. And there's no dialogue. There's just music. And, it's just these two guys looking at each other like, basically, how much have you just screwed me over, is what they're both thinking. But there's nothing but the score and those amazing shots and the editing, and it's this wonderful sense of slow-burning tension. I know this podcast, we're primarily supposed to be talking about the writing, but I want to call out these other elements when they shine like this to tell the story that Gene has written.
There's also a really nice detail of the passage of time when the chief and Paladin are sitting down at the bonfire. Well, it's a little fire. He brings a bundle of sticks in and kind of refreshes the fire. And then you see over time, it just turns into coals and it's almost gone. So you really know that Paladin's waiting a long time for this answer, or waiting for Major Wilson to come back. Here's something, though, that I thought was really interesting. Well, first of all, Paladin has his Derringer tucked in his belt, so he's never really completely defenseless, which I always really dig. But I think this is the first time I've timestamped something certainly in Have Gun and probably in quite a while. But in timestamp 18 minutes 45 seconds, Paladin takes the Major's rifle in the long shot. It's a 2-shot. Then there's a close-up of Paladin, when the Major says something what are you doing, et cetera, et cetera. Then it goes back to the same long shot. Now in this shot, Paladin has a knife. He pulled the knife out of the Major's sheath from his waist. And I'm just wondering if there was a cutscene in there somewhere, because it's just a weird edit, especially since he uses the knife later on, in his altercation with the Major.
Yeah, to cut the bags of gold off of his saddle.
Yeah.
There's another thing that I noticed. I'm fairly certain this happens at least once. At one point, Paladin is holding the knife straight out, very, very straightforward. But you go to another scene, and he's got it in the overhand grip. Mm-hmm. Almost like, I'm ready for stabbing here. And it's that happened very quickly. I did not see that changeover happen.
Yeah.
So perhaps there was some footage that was cut for time. Maybe it was more important to build that tension over the campfire. Mm-hmm. The director just decided, okay, that is where we are going to spend the time, and not the specifics of who's got the knife and how they're holding it. Well, it's time to get a little bit more serious in our hunt for the Yuma Treasure and what depths it may contain. I've got to say, I do have a really big criticism of the episode as shot. Now, with Have Gun Will Travel, I do feel that it's important to point out we are once again dealing with the shows as they were broadcast. And possibly, we were talking about strange edits or, kind of jump cuts in continuity in the previous segment. It is also possible that what we are seeing now, what is on DVD, is what has been preserved since the broadcast, which may well entail further edits from the original, because as time wore on and the expectations of how much ad time you could sell in a show changed, some shows got chopped up and cut down. The original Star Trek suffered this fate in many cases. The original episodes were 51 minutes, and you would find these massive narrative holes opening up. The further into the 70s you were watching the reruns, because the local stations were adding more ad time to it, because at that point the show was a certifiable hit. But it becomes a question of diminishing returns because the story was what made it a hit. We are now cutting out story time. So you always have to be aware that edits could have been made to the script on the way to shooting. Edits could have been made to the show after the show was fully in the can. A lot could have happened here. But that doesn't account for this. There's a scene when Gerada is kind of interrogating Paladin after Major Wilson has fallen off the cliff to his death. And he asks Paladin, you do not have any need of our gold, you're not going to come for our gold? And Paladin responds, all white men have great need for gold, but this was not my gold to take. That line is incredibly troubling. And it's not even just the line itself, it's also Richard Boone's line reading of that line. He says it to Gerada as an admonishment, like, hey kid, this is something you will never understand. I think Gerada understands all too well, because didn't he say that this was his wife's brother? That Major Wilson mortally wounded and sent back to the camp, slumped over on his horse? So another member of Gerada's tribe has died this day. I think he understands all too well what the value of the yellow metal is. And Paladin's a little out of line being condescending like that. But then it continues. At the end of the story, when we have this scene with the colonel who is taking over command of the fort, after, of course, Major Wilson has died, and after Lieutenant Harvey has been arrested, and if I don't think Leavenworth was a thing yet, but that would be where he would be headed. Paladin says, if the Indians are ever relocated, I'd like to do some hunting in those mountains. And there's this little smile that indicates that what he would be hunting would be this gold. Like, okay, he absolutely does know where to find it. I was so ready to heap praise on this episode. But this 1-2 punch right at the end, kind of insensitivity from Paladin, really seems to work against all of the work the show has done, in both Gene's scripts and in other scripts before this one, to make Paladin an honorable character. The thought that he is just waiting for the Maricopas to be relocated, this doesn't seem like the work of the writer who wrote a script we covered just a couple of weeks ago on this show. The story of Sam Houston and Andrew Jackson right at a point just before the tragedy that was the Trail of Tears. I can only speculate as to who decided to end this story with those two scenes. Maybe Gene did do it. Maybe the script editor did it. Maybe the producers added that. I don't know, but it undercuts Paladin's character. And as much as the show tries to make it seem like, okay, this is a man with ethics, this is not a mercenary. He's not a stone-cold mercenary. And yet here we are making him sound like he is exactly that. Did you pick up on this at all?
As we've mentioned before, Earl, like we don't usually read our notes before we get into a discussion because we want to be a little bit more organic with our responses. But when I was going through the notes and there's this is a very specific scene and it has a very specific read. I'm not sure if I saw it the same way that you saw it, and I think that you described, your reaction to it incredibly and well articulated. I was thinking about what is going on with this scene and why was it written like this and what did I get out of it? And I see exactly what you're saying. I mean, I see that, there is a little bit of, maybe it's kind of like a misfire here when it came to the execution. But I want to kind of set the tone of where I'm coming from with this one scene in Brian De Palma's Untouchables. All right, so this is a scene where a reporter asks Elliot Ness, the law-abiding crusader defending prohibition, tooth and nail, like to the letter of the law. He's told that prohibition has been lifted. And then he's asked to do what is he going to do next since he doesn't have this crusade to fight? And then he says, I think I'll have a drink. There's a certain matter of factness to while it is under the purview of the law, this is what I'm going to enforce. And when it's not, I won't. But it doesn't necessarily mean that he doesn't want to. So what I think Paladin's saying in this scene is that he too has a need for gold, as he referenced earlier when he told Wilson he was going to use it to buy their lives so that the Maricopa don't kill them for betraying them. But he also says to Gerada that this gold isn't his to take, hence returning the gold down into the valley. I see what you're saying. Like, well, sure, I'm just going to dump it on this cliff of which I've completely mentally mapped out, right? So that when you aren't here, if you are ever going to be moved, then I just come back here, find all of these different points, in my mental map and find that dumped gold. And of course, the Maricopa don't find it first. So yes, I think that there is something that's truthful about him saying all white men have a need for gold, but I think it depends on how it's used and acquired. There's a line that you and I love from a show called Babylon 5 where Commander Sinclair says to Michael Garibaldi, everybody lies, Michael. It's kind of how you use the lie. I think that's where Paladin is. It's not a question of do all white men want gold? Yes, but what are we going to use it for and why? Now, I do think that the resolution is a little glib at the end at the fort where Paladin says, if they're going to be moved, then I'll go and hunt for something. And it's obviously going to be the gold. But I didn't see it as glib, as more of a matter of fact, like Elliot Ness. If the Maricopa are there, then I won't do it. If they aren't there, then I will. And I think it's interesting that we know Have Gun Will Travel so well that we are projecting like our love for the character and his honor on a character that they don't know in the 1950s that well. Is he developing along the way right now? Like I said, I don't think it's hypocritical about him being a quote-unquote mercenary at the beginning of the series. I mean, we're only 14 episodes in, and we're only in the second of Gene's scripts. So we project what kind of a hero he is from our perception, but in 1957 or 1958, maybe there's going to be room to grow, because we're only in it this early, and even Paladin, as established as he is, has to have room to grow. So again, I think that I just wanted to bring this up because you had a very specific, very interesting read on it. And I don't disagree. I just see it a little bit differently. That's all.
And now I can't help but think of, where's Major Wilson? He's in the car. Not to go too far down the Untouchables rabbit hole, but I feel like the Elliot Ness scene that you're talking about, which I remember very well because I love that movie, it almost felt to me like, in just the second it took for Ness to come up with that reaction, there was kind of an internal dialogue. Wow, you look at all the trouble prohibition as a law caused. Look at what it made me do. Yeah, you're damn straight, I'm going to go get a drink. And so I feel like the underpinnings are very different there. It's not like, hey, I'm wearing a badge, but now I'm going to go break the law. And of course, Paladin doesn't wear a badge, but as always, he is summoned by whoever the authority is. And perhaps I am guilty of grafting, like, Season 3 Paladin onto Season 1 Paladin, basically, is how you're putting it. And you know, that may be a fault, because I don't remember what order I first saw these episodes in. And of course, we're in that wonderful era of very episodic TV where it may not have mattered what order you saw it in, because it was all self-contained, and it was not going to be followed up on. There was no continuity. Hit the reset button, reset the registers, we're ready for next week's episode. And that's entirely possible. It struck me wrong because we were earlier saying so much Sam Houston DNA has obviously been grafted onto Paladin, and I found myself kind of weighing those two lines, those two scenes against, would Sam Houston have said this? Oh, hell no.
I mean, I think that's really fair. I mean, we see a lot of Sam Houston, and maybe more than Paladin so far. Again, in the first 14 episodes, and certainly the 2 that we're reviewing for Gene's scripts. I mean, there's a scene where Paladin first arrives with the 2 Indians as his guides, and then he meets with Lieutenant Harvey and the sergeant, and they're giving him static. And he looks at them and he says, unless anything's changed, like, you know, War Department 7-104 is still on the books, you know, like a regulation. He said he's using the law against them. He's using their own tactics, you know, his own understanding of exactly how things operate, you know, within the confines of Army regulations to his advantage, you know. And we see that with how Sam Houston, you know, used the law in Destiny and the Raven in Exile, right? You know, because that's the only way he's going to be able to negotiate himself out of these situations, either by cultural law with the Indians or by, you know, United States law with the United States military and the codes and the treaties that they've established. So that is Paladin's, you know, his intellect at work. And I think that's really smart of Gene to bring this. He's not just, you know, bring it over from Sam Houston. He's not just a gun for hire. He's not just a mercenary. He's a thinking man soldier, you know, and he thinks before he has to act, you know, violently or, you know, in kind. It's kind of like the whole thing with the snake that we were talking about earlier in Observations. It wasn't just a snake. It was a test of what Paladin actually knows about the Yuma and the Maricopa people, so that he speaks straight without a split tongue, and he knows how to negotiate honestly with these people. That's Sam Houston when he was working with the Seminoles and the Pawnee and Cherokee, I think, in the scripts that we've read. And it adds a lot, you know, to the backstory without actually showing the backstory. So, but I think that you're right about the whole, we're grafting the Sam Houston, quote unquote, honorable character based on what we read in Gene's script and treatment for the pitch in the 2 scripts. And projecting that onto this character as of right now, plus our love for the character as we were able to, you know, understand him. Now, far be it from us to not try and insert some type of history lesson here, but because we're dealing with this specific era of the post-Civil War Old West of essentially a fictionalized but historical time, we've mentioned the 2 Indian tribes that were featured in this episode, especially over there in the Southwest, and that would be the Yuma and the Maricopa Indians, and to some extension the Mojave Indians, because we had the Great Mojave Chase in the previous episode. But I wanted to kind of give everyone like the historical context of where we are in this time, like in the 1870s, you know, if you will. So this excerpt for the Maricopa history comes from the Gila River Indian Community website from about 1846 to about 1920. In 1846, southern Arizona fell under the influence of the United States following the Mexican-American War. In 1848, gold was discovered in California, and tens of thousands of ill-prepared men streamed across America, heading towards dreams of riches. One of the primary routes was across southern Arizona. Between 1849 and 1851, an estimated 60,000 travelers arrived among our peaceful people, many starving or near death from dehydration and or wounds inflicted in the battle by the warring Apache to the east and the human tribes to the west of our lands. Here the travelers rested and ate well, enjoying our bounty of wheat, corn, beans, pumpkins, watermelon, squash, peas, and other foods. Indeed, one grateful member of the Mormon Battalion wrote in his journal in 1846, en route from New Mexico to California to secure that state during the Mexican-American War, quote, "They are a noble race," end quote. And wrote Lieutenant Sylvester Mowry in 1857, quote, "Their stores of wheat and corn have supplied many a starved emigrant and restored his broken-down animals," end quote. We were also hospitable to other tribes as well. In the 1840s, though some sources suggest this occurred as early as the mid-1700s, the Akimil-O'Otham offered refuge to the Maricopa tribe, a human tribal people who had been driven eastward from the lower Colorado River area by other human tribes. The Maricopa, who called themselves the Peeposh, settled within the Akimil-O'Otham, and to this day we share the space and the resources of the Gila River lands. In 1864, the Gadsden Purchase officially made southern Arizona part of a United States territory. In appreciation for the important role that the Akimil-O'Otham played in the American westward expansion, in 1859 Congress established the first reservation in Arizona, encompassing 372,000 acres along the Gila River. In 1862, putting our agricultural skills to work, our people grew more than 1 million pounds of wheat, most of which we sold. Our prospects looked good. And now we are coming to the time, this is me talking, this is Norm talking, we're coming to the time where this story really takes place. However, our lifeblood, the Gila River water, was cut off in the 1870s and 1880s by construction of upstream diversion structures and dams by non-native farmers, and our farming was largely wiped out. From 1880 to 1920 or so, we faced mass famine and starvation. The federal government stepped in and doled out canned and processed foods by the ton. The change in diet proved disastrous, leading to extremely high rates of obesity and diabetes, a condition we still face today. With almost no jobs available on the reservation and the loss of our cash crops, our people faced widespread poverty as well. Alcoholism raised its ugly head, and our people experienced the loss of certain cultural and artistic traditions and rituals. It was the darkest moment in our long history. So in 1873, as per Paladin's Peacemaker, the model 1873, this is that time where we're starting to see the influence of the American military and westward expansion start to take like the most negative turn and toll on the Native American peoples. I just want to put that in there in context so that you know what's happening outside of the sphere of Paladin's story as it's unfolding in history.
We come to these little moments in history and these historical notes like this where I almost have nothing to say because I'm just rocked back on my heels with the shame of it all.
So we have made it with the end of our adventure with the Yuma Treasure. I think we've come up, well, treasure-wise we've come up kind of empty-handed, but I think that we've come up in spades when it comes to what we do here at Mission Log, when we find the morals and meanings and messages, if we can actually mine that treasure out of these episodes. And let's see, we had a lot to talk about. I think that we still have a little bit more to put this episode to bed. And we'll start with Earl. How did you feel about this episode, and were you able to find any morals or meanings or messages contained therein?
Well, this, at the risk of repeating what I said in the previous segment, I found the messages here to be extremely mixed. This episode really feels like a case study of what I personally... This is a term that I have come up with, the chasing Amy effect. It's a great story for the first 97% of its running time, and then some weird curveball gets thrown in right at the end, and that undercuts everything that the story seemed like it was setting out to achieve. And again, we're on that weird 1-2 punch at the end. All white men have a great need of gold. followed by the weird little scene where it seems like Paladin would be happy to come back and take the Maricopa's gold after they have been driven from their territory? Really? This just doesn't sit well with me. I understood what we were saying in the last segment about, kind of comparing it to a line at the end of the movie, The Untouchables. But I still feel like these two sentiments are dwelling in very different spaces. The Yuma Treasure is a fascinating and suspenseful little story, beautifully shot. You cannot take that away from it. It is beautifully shot. But those two pieces of dialogue at the end make it seem as though not that much separates Paladin from Major Wilson, as the story would have had us believe for the first 22 minutes. It's amazing how that little bit of weirdness in the last 3 minutes moves the needle from it holds up well over time to what in the world were you thinking? Paladin's willingness to wait out the Maricopa's claim to their own land. This is not that the problem is not that it is incompatible with Paladin as we saw him last week. It's incompatible with Paladin as we saw him at the beginning of this week's episode. It does not chime with the character as he has already been established. So, I don't know who wrote those scenes, but they land all kinds of wrong for me, and really, the Maricopa Gold may still be shining, but it really took the shine off this episode for me.
Fair points, Earl, and I think that we had a really great discussion about that also in the earlier segment. And I think that we're both kind of like focusing on, or maybe even doubling down a little bit, like on like the way that particular scene or how it wrapped up like resonated with us individually. Now, I never thought that I would reference Oliver Stone's Wall Street and an episode of Have Gun Will Travel in the same podcast, but I can't help but quote Gordon Gekko's most famous scene in Wall Street when he says, "Greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed, in all its forms, greed for life, for money, for love, knowledge, has marked the upward surge of mankind." However, no matter how inspirational this scene may be to some, the truth of this quote is in its irony. There's a universal understanding of human greed, what it can do to people and how some people have no choice but to act on such greed. When Paladin bargains for his standard $1,000 fee for his services, Major Wilson barks back at Paladin and says, "You know what I've risked my life for? $62 a month. Does that make you better than I am? Does that make your life worth more?" Wilson, like many people then and now, believe that in some way that they are entitled to more, or believe they've been overlooked or neglected or slighted in some way. And greed has the ability to turn people like this so quickly and even in ways they didn't even expect. Now, at the end of the episode, the base colonel says to Paladin that Major Wilson was an honest man. And Paladin swallowed hard to not say anything in response. And I'd like to believe that that pause was specifically scripted by Gene as a way for we, the audience, to interpret Paladin's silence for understanding. And in that flash of a moment, he remembered the conversation he had with Wilson at the beginning of the episode. Perhaps there was a bit of empathy there in Paladin about Wilson's plight, about how his life of service at $62 a month, which in today's 2024 dollars would be less than $1,500 a month or $18,000 a year. Now, I'm not condoning Wilson's behavior in any way, but given the desperation that he's suffering and looking at a lifetime of service summed up in, $200 worth of savings? When the temptation of the treasure of a lifetime is at your fingertips, the pull of greed can sometimes be too great.
I'm okay with Paladin sympathizing and empathizing with the Major. It's just that this thing at the end, like, oh yeah, maybe I'll come back after these people are gone, and then I can take their gold, and it's okay. that's the part that just lands wrong with me. It's just like, no, that's not okay. Mission Log Gene-ology is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. If you would like to support us directly, you can do so at patreon.com/missionlog for early access to shows and the Mission Log Discord. If you have any material that might be of interest to us that isn't already in the Roddenberry archive, drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com. Our website is missionlogpodcast.com.
On the next Gene-ology, The Hanging Cross. Special thanks to consulting producers Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, Julie Miller, Mike Richards, Mike Schabel, Paul Shadwell, and David Takechi.
We'll be back next week with more of your favorite programs. This concludes our broadcast day.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.